Welcome back to another episode of Stork Talks.
I'm Zoe.
And I'm Tom.
Now, today is World Press Freedom Day. And this week, Stork Talks looks at the past, present, and future of media communication and how multimodal methods of communication are changing the way we view and consume news. The global pandemic has had a huge impact on already existing trends.
Absolutely, Zoe. We took a look at the 2020 Digital News Report by the Reuters Institute, based on the EU government survey of over 80,000 online news consumers in 40 markets. And the detailed results make for a fascinating read. Perhaps most interestingly, they show that the news consumption in general has gone up, with TV news up 14% in Europe and an increased use of social media as people look to stay informed about the virus while living in greater isolation.
Yes, many reported concern about how their local news outlets will be affected. And they also found that only 38% of respondents said that they trusted the news most of the time. This follows a general downward trend in trust in the news and media from previous years. In fact, 56% of respondents admitted that they were concerned about what was real news and what is fake news. So as a result, more engaging formats like podcasts are being used to improve trust and to engage audiences.
Yeah, and in today's hyper-technological world, new and fascinating methods of multimodal communication are popping up all the time. Increasingly, there's a focus on what we term immersive experiences, methods of communication that engage all of your senses and encourage you to completely immerse yourself in an experience. VR and AR are excellent examples of such immersive technologies, but there are multiple other ways in which we can become more engaged, and audience engagement is what today's media is all about. And that's why, without further ado, we would like to welcome our guest of today to talk about this topic, Petra Ardai. Welcome, Petra.
Hello, nice to see you. Nice to meet you.
Welcome, Petra. Now, Petra is the artistic director of the Amsterdam and Budapest-based art collective called Space. Petra has wide experience making documentary theatre and immersive storytelling in various media. She produces interactive performances, multimedia installations, online art, heritage apps, and podcasts. So, Petra, we really look forward to having you today on Stork Talks so that we can dig into some of these fascinating topics. Perhaps we can start with a apparently simple question. What does communication in its broadest sense mean to you?
Yeah, that was my cat. I'm sorry if you hear my cat. I mean, that's a form of communication, right? It's like reaching
Indeed.
out to get some food. Yeah, so I think there's nothing really else than communication. I mean, we are trying to make contact, and every time you make contact with words, you make contact with body language, you make contact with where you take a spot in a space. So, yeah, I think what is communication? Communication is everything. So I don't really, cannot really do anything else about it. But what do you understand why we are communicating? That's another issue, I think.
But now, Petra, I know that you've already mentioned this to us. You've mentioned the idea that for you, communication in essentially the narrative or storytelling encompasses most forms or many forms of communication. So perhaps you can just tell us a little bit more about that way of looking at things.
Right. So I actually think that the impact of storytelling or making narratives is highly underestimated in society, because in general I don't think there is anything else. As I don't think there's anything else than communication, I can also say that there is nothing else than storytelling. Because if you look at your memories, I mean, what's happening in your head, your thoughts, they are a kind of narrative that is inside your head. Most of the things are recycling past memories. So in a way, that is fictitious because it's not present yet anymore here. So you are in a way remembering things, and when you remember things, happen, but you recall them, so they're not happening now. So in that sense, they are tending towards the fictitious. So it is anyway a narrative that you generate in your head, your thoughts, right? And if you imagine the future, or you think about what's going to happen, that's naturally also fiction, because you don't know yet, because it didn't happen yet. So the only thing what's really truly authentic and real is the moment, but it's already past, right? So you can't really grasp it. It's stuck between past and future, between two fictitious narratives. So if you already take the idea of how human psychic functions, you cannot detach the idea of narratives or storytelling from it. And if you talk about communication, you communicate these narratives to the others. And it's good if you are quite aware of what your narrative or what your story evokes in the other, right? It's not only what you say, but how you say it, right? That can really, infiltrate into the storytelling machine of the other human, because we are more or less 24/7 storytelling machines. We are even dreaming, right? So, And if you look at it from a more a wider perspective, like what's coming through the media, what's coming, or the economic narrative, or the political narrative, or the religious narratives that are all out there, you can get easily lost. So there is this, there are dominant narratives, and then sometimes you don't even know, but you follow a narrative because everybody follows it, and you don't want to fall out, right? So, like, let's say, for example, that growth economy is quite a difficult narrative. I mean, it results in overconsumption and all sorts of highly bad impact things for the future of the planet. Still, it's very difficult for yourself to detach from that narrative of the growth economy.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe it's a good idea to try and look through all these narratives and all these forms of communication through some of the projects that you have done, to give people some tangible idea. So you've dedicated much of your working life to some of these immersive projects, which, like you said, there's many different ways to tell these narratives, and as such, you encompass multi-model methods of communication. Some of the examples, like the called Fake Me Hard, Robot Love, and the Plurality University, are some of the projects that stood out to us. And perhaps for the listeners, you can help conceptualize these projects and what inspired you about them, and link that to the story of narratives and communication.
Okay. Those things they are not really. I will explain them indeed, but to make it, my work is about making people more aware of how narratives are made, and making their choices, and reclaiming ownership of the narrative. That's what I'm doing with everything I do. It's the podcast, it's a heritage app where you walk on a site, and you are completely detached from the past, and then we make it in a way that you can imagine what would you feel if that would happen to you, or when you look into the migration question or climate migrants, then what would I feel if I would stand in Moria? So that's more or less the politics of the personal. They make immersive experiences of understanding how do we relate our story to the stories that are out there. That's what I do. And the projects that you mentioned, Plurality University, I'm founding member. It's a French-based organization of academics and designers and artists, and it's a global network. So it's also with countries with a non-Western background, and we are trying to find new future narratives that are more inclusive and more locally and globally rooted. And
could you give us an example, like a concrete example of a more local narrative that perhaps here in the Netherlands, or just so that people, that our listeners can have something concrete to clutch onto?
Well, I can do a very, very simple one. Like there is a farming movement in the Netherlands called the Herenboeren. And that is like a little community of people who come together, and they start on a ground which is really there is a scarcity of ground in the Netherlands, right, to use, and the ground is really, really expensive, so they cannot buy it. But it's not, they don't own the land, but they find the land that is not used, for example, around the roundabout or kind of stuff. I'm making it a bit funny now. And they work together with a farmer, and together they decide what they're gonna grow on that piece of land, and more or less they manage with a kind of with the salary of one farmer, that they have their own grocery and food. So it's locally produced food, completely fair, and it has a social aspect. It gives good life to one farmer, and but they're really exercising it, that they don't overconsume, and they are really responsible. They don't like land ownership. That's really an incredibly difficult narrative, and it's a very exclusive narrative. It works with disclosure. I mean, people who own land. Yeah,
it's also very powerful. I mean, land ownership has been with us for a long time.
Right. I mean, that's where it all comes from, right? And then people who are working on that land, and why is it your land? So then we are in the economy of the commons. So they are exercising the economy of the commons combined with their everyday lives. So that's very locally rooted, and at the same time responsible, so also very globally responsible, I think.
Okay, so in this sort of, you would categorize that as an immersive experience, and in so experiencing it, you would obviously, these people, as you say, would maybe be exposed to a different sort of narrative from the dominant meta-narrative of land ownership.
They made themselves loose from the dominant narrative and made their own initiative. I mean, there are other grassroots examples for that as well, but the question was the locally and globally. And so that's what I answered. I mean, this is naturally not, I work with the Heraburen because I help them imagine how they could grow. So when they, so I'm very often asked when people need to imagine something, like, because I'm originally a theater maker, I'm making scenarios, right? So I'm asked in the social domain, also I'm working in the art field, and also in science. And often I'm asked when something has to be imagined, but is not yet president, so it's not yet here. So you need to go beyond the protocol. So like I work with crisis scenarios for Amsterdam in the living lab of the Free University of Amsterdam, where they try to put the police and the ambulance, and so the traditional crisis parties, police, ambulance, fire brigade, and citizen, to work together in a moment of a disaster. There's a point why I'm saying this. So when there is a disaster, in the first first hour, nothing can happen, because the municipality needs to be completely sure of that there is really a disaster, so that it's not only a narrative, right? So that's one thing, that it's already shifting, right? So when there is something really happening, a crisis, then civilians are immediately active, and the traditional parties are waiting. So there is such a problem with collaboration there. So they were trying to make it more efficient. And of course, naturally, a disaster is not a disaster if you can prepare for it. So that's when the artists come in. Until you can prepare, it's not a disaster, because then you can prepare. So how do you prepare for the unknown? Then they ask if I can create an immersive experience, or how do you imagine what it would be to live locally and globally rooted? Then they asked me to help imagine it.
So I think that is an interesting point, because like you said, there's many different narratives that you help people, many scenarios that you create to help other people, perhaps bring them along that vision or that idea. And specifically related to the topic, there was one scenario scenario that you created or helped create that we would like to explore further, which was called Fake Me Hard, which was a conference about fake news. And I was curious, we were curious as to sort of say, well, why is it so important that we think about what that future scenario might look like, or what that might entail for the future, and bring that back to where we are today?
Yeah, Fake Me Hard is working now, and I'm not part of Fake Me Hard. I was part of Robot Lab, which is the same organization, right? So I didn't work on Fake Me Hard. to be honest.
Okay.
But I can tell about.
I mean, because Petra, we're interested obviously on focusing on the media aspects and the news part. So that's why we'd like to hear a bit more about Fake Me Hard if you know about it. Otherwise, we can move on.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know too much about it. I just know the organization and how they worked at the Dutch Design Week with Robot Lab and before that with Impossible Bodies. And they are always trying to really look at a theme from a very interconnected perspective, like from all sides. And I can tell more about Robot Lab because that's what I did. Like they did changing your relationship towards machines and not blaming machines for things that may be more related to human desires and human mistakes. And more or less, that's also what I think about news and fake news. Like you can. So when you talk about the media and blame the media, you detach from humans. And this is all human work. It's human storytelling in the media. It's interpretation of things you saw. It's you tell it for a certain reason. So whenever there is the intention behind it is not unclear, or then it goes wrong. I mean, I cannot make it more fancy. I mean, if somebody wants to get a lot of attention and then makes a sensational news, but it has no real, it's not fact checked, then it goes wrong.
Then it's fiction, isn't it? Then this is just yet another form of storytelling, perhaps.
Right. I think in general, I use the word storytelling for all kinds of all the narratives, this web of narratives we live in. And because I also consider sensory experiences and body language also, and visuality also a narrative. But indeed, fiction is it's often fiction, yeah. What happens in the media. And also how it's interpreted, but also outside of the media, I mean, yeah. So I think it's about the intention. How is something,
What's the intention behind it? Okay, well, perhaps we can move on, Petra. I mean, you've spoken a little bit about some of your projects, and as you've said, they're all in many ways immersive projects, which are, from my understanding, they are designed to optimize audience engagement and co-creative experiences. I mean, do you think that this is the future of communications more generally? Do you think we will see in all areas of communication, including the media, will we see increased immersive to the way that we consume stories and information generally?
I think you dropped out.
I think so.
You dropped out for a little, Zoe. So you could quickly do the last bit again. And
sorry.
Sorry,
Petra. I'll just ask you again and say, do you think that in the future we will see an increased move towards immersive projects for across communication fields, including media, but just in general, because it does seem via technology, but also maybe via some of the methods that you've been talking about, people like and perhaps are expecting increasingly immersive experiences.
Right. So when it goes wrong, I think it's about intention and not well prepared or using things for establishing power or whatever. And the immersivity is also it works only if it's on an equal base. So when we talk about immersive storytelling on Facebook, that's not immersive storytelling because there is a program algorithm that makes us slave of the storytelling of Facebook. So when we talk about immersive storytelling and immersive exchange of news or information, then we talk about on an equal level. That's what I'm trying to do. So I'm create conditions that people get aware of what's happening to them. How do they relate to this big issue? How does that, from climate change, migration, inequality, discrimination appears in their daily life, this exclosure or connectedness, how does that appear in their life? Yeah. So, and then we make an immersive experience that you can incorporate, you can empathize with a certain position that is maybe not yours. So you might understand how someone who thinks completely different than you, so then immersive storytelling immersive experiences can depolarize, because you can place yourself in the other, right? And you can do that in text, you can do that in a radio play or a podcast, so you can do it so it's not anymore about the medium, I think. It's about that whenever you make this exchange and it is coming from a good intention and it is on an equal base, then it can't go wrong. But that's not what's really happening. So when these coordinates shift, then you get fake news, then you get, it seems immersive, but it's not immersive, because you are participating in a dominant narrative. So that's what went wrong with the Rohingya people in Myanmar. Through Facebook, Facebook was really big part of the genocide that happened there, because of the algorithm is programmed in a way that they were unwished people, right?
Okay, I think you raised some very interesting points, Petra. You're suggesting that immersive experiences can increase empathy if they're used in a careful and perhaps equal way, but that they can also be very overwhelming if, as you say, you step into an immersive experience that is essentially a dominant, overwhelming narrative. So what I understand is that we're seeing two different views of this sort of immersive experience. One that is positive and helpful, and the other one that is quite negative and destructive.
Also, that you don't know when you are on Facebook, you don't know that you are in an immersive experience. I mean, you don't realize how it infiltrates into your. So immersive is that it emerges that it goes into your, yes. So we are continuous, and there are nearly no not immersive experiences. We are just not completely aware of it. What's the how the immersion is going, let's say, and that's what I'm. When there is transparency about the exchange, then nothing really can go wrong. But even when something goes wrong, then we say, oh, then you say to me, Petra, this is not what I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about that, right? Or so then you can, because we are on the same level. You are not pressuring me. You told me this is gonna be on YouTube as well, uncut. So I'm aware of my conditions, and that's very. So you address me equally. And this is not really happening. This is not happening on the side of the media, and people who collaborate on social media, they are not aware of in what kind of storytelling they are participating.
So what I find interesting, and you're sort of, in a way, focusing on storytelling, but trying to not tell a story, but show people that the stories that are being told are not exactly on the same level. Is you're telling the story of the people who are telling the stories, so the people on Facebook and the companies, basically, that they're perhaps not on the same level, so there's a disparity between them, and you're telling the story looking from the outside towards how these stories are being told. Is that an appropriate way to sort of summarize it?
Yeah. I mean, and I'm not really. So it's very important, whatever you do, that you don't put yourself outside of the problem. So I am in this with you guys and with all humanity. So I'm not better or worse. So I cannot talk about this. I can share ideas about this and learn from each other. So if it's not that I am telling someone that this is like that, so that's very important. I think that you approach it from a from kind of eco base, that I am also sensitive to social media, and so I can't preach, right, or moralize on the issue, and I wouldn't do that, because then I would even polarize more. So what I can just say is that I got a kind of understanding on how stories are created and how narratives are fabricated. And so I create experiences, like the last work I'm working is Rehearsing the Revolution. and that is the research project for my next work, the Common Ground Dialogues. The Common Ground Dialogues will be a communication game, storytelling game, in which people with very different background can exercise to find common grounds through storytelling, right? In the fiction, because we actually experience that when you create a common ground in a fiction, where you have to go through conflicts and making a revolution, right? So it's not, you shouldn't disappear a kind of political correctness and softy utopian thing. In fiction, you are playing. You can do anything. Yeah, you can play the most wildest ideas. And if you find there then common ground in the fiction, in the game, that common ground remains in reality in the communities. We tested that. And this phenomena is the core of this new work, the Common Ground Dialogues. I do it with scientists and this and that. It's a more-year program. But towards that, I'm working on rehearsing the revolution, which makes fictitious revolutions. And how I got here, I don't know, but I did.
Yeah, okay.
No, I think indeed it's like there are so many different avenues to the topic that are interesting to explore, and there's so much going on. And one thing that I want to point out and that I want to focus on is, you said it's very important to find common ground. And one topic that we are speaking about is also the development of media, so the past, present, and future. And what I think is interesting is that we see a decrease in the trust in media, where back in the days we all had the same media, we all had the same level, we may have all watched the same 8 o'clock news, for example, so we all had sort of a baseline. Nowadays, like you said, people might get their Facebook from multiple different sources, some from social media, some from Facebook, which results in this mistrust and perhaps a loss of common ground. And I think what's interesting, what is a follow-up result of that, is a mistrust and disengagement of this mainstream media, of this common ground. So as someone who focuses on scenarios, what could be a solution to this problem, to this growing mistrust in the common ground or in the common narrative?
I have to tell you something really strange, because I'm coming from Hungary and growing up in a communistic system. There was one media, and nobody trusted it, and that created a common ground. So I'm just telling you, it's all about story. I mean, you cannot detach the media from storytelling. So when we are telling our story for the listeners, right? And every time when there is a good intention, a transparent intention behind it, then there is a chance to create common ground. Or when it's so obviously wrong, what it was back then it also creates common ground, because it's rather transparent that it's not functioning. But now, for example, if Hungary or other Eastern European countries, if you take them, there's a very diffused storytelling that comes also falls on so there's no training of democratic communications, right? So that's one of the problems. The other problems is that the media is overruled by the government. So in that sense, it's not really giving the news what's really happening, or but it's more or less censored, right? What's coming out. I mean, it's not more or less, it is censored. So yeah.
Okay, I mean, I think perhaps what we wanted to also get at, Petra, is this notion that increasingly news organizations are looking to make their offerings perhaps more interactive, even on a quite a low level, to attract audience engagement. But this perhaps is not, as you said, there's different forms of interaction. Perhaps this is not always so positive. I think this is what we're getting at, is, does interactive engagement necessarily improve our trust, or is it only under some special circumstances, as you've suggested? And if indeed that is the case, how could that be applied maybe to the media of today? How can they regain trust, given that we're working within the social media world?
Well, I think it's also a phase. So first there was the kind of, so probably we are in a phase of growing and learning about things, right? Like media wisdom, that people also more and more understand what is fake, what is, So that I don't know what's the next step, but there was first no social media, then there is social media, then we are happy with social media. Now we are trying to see the borders of it. So I don't know what's the next step.
How would you imagine it, Petra? Because this is what you do, yes? So how would you imagine this future for us?
Look, when it comes to the tendencies of now, it's like people really need silence. So my idea would be a little bit of silence and daring to be in silence. That would be my future scenario. It's very scary.
It may be for many people, true.
Yeah. But that could be probably a little bit of good to really clean out the gibbery and what's not necessary and reestablish now we know how it can go wrong and what are the movements of we are getting to understand what incredible power it is, this social media machine, and combined with media from television to everything. So now that we understand it, then how can we really use it, right? So that's but as the story of the media, as the story of everything on earth is more or less ruled by a few people and not really ruled by bottom up. So it would be maybe best if we go through all the problems, but it would be more equally bottom up and top down, and that would be probably good.
Okay. I think that brings us on to our last question, Tom, doesn't it? It's connected to the local.
Yeah, I think so too. What I really like, some of the philosophical questions you pose, Petra, is they sort of just leave, like they start the brain and they start everybody thinking like, yeah, but that's an excellent question. Like, how would we do that? And what do we do that? And one of the topics that we were thinking about as well is the fact that the immense influx of news from this globalized society can be overwhelming. And that sometimes nowadays we turn to our local communities, something that we understand, something that is closer to home. And we were wondering, perhaps would this sort of pendulum swing backwards towards a more local focus be able to rebuild the trust that we have in the media, because we feel like we know the people where it's coming from. So to sort of quote, locally rooted but globally interested.
Yeah, I think that would be really good. And you see also my first example with the Herebura, so that they are a local community and taking care of their own ecological footprint, let's say, which is actually has a global effect, right? So you shouldn't underestimate it. So the principles of thinking is the same. We could do that also with video. Whenever something gets, so if I know the journalist, and if I know what is what he or she writes about, because it's indeed that playground or that little community garden there, and or the local library, and it has some connection to me, and I can live it, and it's connected to the economy of the commons, right? So not so private sufficiency and public luxury, that would be a good idea, and local radio or local media could really facilitate that new way of living, this cultural shift. And this cultural shift, that you are locally rooted and responsible globally for your ideas. So that's not that you don't care about what's happening on the other side of the world, but you, through your experience, you understand the farmer in India is doing the same, or I don't know, that's a bit of a parallel, but I think that would be a really good approach. Yeah, private sufficiency, public luxury, like George Monbiot would say. It's not from me, but that could be a cultural shift that local media could really help, and that would
embrace.
Be really for the world, I think. So guys, go on.
we know what we need to do. Our work is cut out for us.
Yes.
All right, time flies as always. This was a fascinating and hugely slightly overwhelming conversation, but I think that can be a good thing sometimes to have something that doesn't fit neatly into a box. Thank you so much for joining us today, Petra, on Stork Talks. To our audience, to our listeners, if your interest has been piqued by any of the very many fascinating topics we touched on, or any of Petra's fascinating projects, you can find out more information on the website, and I believe it's www.spaceexplorers.nl. Petra, is there any other place where people can find out more if they want to, or did you want to direct them to another
I think
spot?
that's the best. Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Zoe already said it, but thank you, Petra, for joining us. It was a delight to have you and to have our narratives challenged and our minds opened up to the possibilities that we may see in the future.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We were glad to present it, and to our listeners we would say thank you as well for joining us for another episode of the Stork Talks podcast. If you want to find out more about previous episodes, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Anchor, and remember that you'll be able to watch the full unedited interview with Petra on our YouTube channel called Stork Talks. Thank you for stalking with us this week, and we look forward to welcoming you back in the next.